Hi everyone, welcome to our live stream discussion on digital resilience and disaster response. My name is Lara Satrakian. I'm the CEO and executive editor of News Deeply, and we have the benefit of convening today's conversation with some fantastic panelists. This conversation is being held in partnership with the UN Foundation, with Datto, whose CEO, McChord, is with us here on the panel, and with the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University. We're delighted to have one of their colleagues, Mark Patterson, here with us as well. So why don't we start with a bit of introduction. I really like having folks present themselves. So let's just work our way down from Mark toward me.
Sure.
What are you looking at in resilience, and really, what does digital resilience really mean to folks who are coming at this new?
So the mission of the Global Resilience Institute is to make individuals, communities, and whole societies resilient at all levels. And we define resilience as being able to bounce back quickly and degrade gracefully, but perhaps put into place measures so that you don't degrade in the first place. And part of my portfolio as Chief Technology Officer is to look for new solutions. And we've got many, many faculty that are experts in critical infrastructure resilience at Northeastern, as well as social networks. And one thing we've identified, and it's not just us, McKinsey and Company, Deloitte, have all done in-depth studies of the importance of a connected workforce and connected communities in our digital economy. And when these systems degrade, it's often because of the communications infrastructure falling apart. So we're working intently on trying to come up with a new solution that involves making communications resilient to the loss of cell phone towers. We want to make every city on Earth able to cope with the cell phone towers going away. That could be due to a natural disaster, could be due to a cyber attack, or something else that human beings do. So that's our focus near term, and we were very excited by what we heard this morning. This is now the age of the empowered neighborhood, the mesh network. There are many enabling technologies that didn't exist even 18 to 24 months ago, new software development toolkits. And this is a very exciting time to try and enhance digital resilience and preserve connectivity that we all rely on so heavily now in both our personal lives and in our business transactions.
So Mark, just to add a little context for folks here and the folks watching the live stream, earlier today we got to hear from some leaders in technology, mesh networks, humanitarian organizations, UN agencies working on this. And in terms of context, can you give us a little bit of color on the uptick in natural disasters and the events that are causing these kinds of disruptions, and the connectivity rise that you're describing here that makes this such a vulnerable mix and such an important conversation?
Sure. It is true. I'm actually a global change biologist when I'm not doing communications resilience. I've been studying coral reefs for most of my career, and they're the first major ecosystem on Earth that is probably going to go functionally extinct because of the rapidity of climate change. So the frequency and scope of how the planet is changing is formidable. The insurance industry is just now catching up. We heard actually a comment during our discussion this morning that instead of planning for the 1 out of every 10-year disaster, we should be planning for the 1 out of every 50-year disaster. But in reality, the new normal is the once every 500-year disaster may be coming the once every 10 to 20-year disaster. That's how rapidly things are changing. Fast forward to hurricanes and coupled with unusual black swan events that often involve flooding, precipitation, storm surge in ways that we haven't seen before.
Like, just to give some clarity, these events that were supposed to be happening once every 500 years are now happening regularly, and we'll hear more from Mary on that. Yeah.
And given that everybody lives along the coast, or not everybody, but more than half the planet seems to be living along the coast now. We've got so many vulnerable coastal cities. I'm a member of the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department as well at Northeastern, and every spring our talented undergraduates seniors have to do a capstone project. And they work in teams for a client, and the client's often a municipality or a business, and they work on this project for 6 months. And then I have the pleasure of helping judge and watch their capstone presentations that they actually give to the client as if they were already their own business. More than half of what they're doing at Northeastern in Boston are for figuring out resilient solutions to infrastructure that's greatly at risk in Boston from storm surge that's being exacerbated by sea level rise.
And when that happens, now, sort of moving over to Austin, both in terms of what you do, but these are communities you work in and your clients work in. Tell us your view on all this.
Yeah, sure. I think that, our position is really around looking at a lot of those businesses and commercial entities that don't have the resources to do the pre-planning that the multinationals do. And what's ended up happening over the past decade or so is that basically every business out there has become a tech-enabled business, and then every business is now in some transition where they rely on some number of services from the cloud. And what that means is that with a communications infrastructure breakdown, business just stops. It just ends. And so they need these links. And in our case, we work with a whole sea of managed service providers, so actually on the ground, these virtual CIOs that are serving as the IT operators for these hundreds of thousands of small businesses. And we want to build tools to help them sort of close that gap so that they can recover and continue to operate and be, as resilient as Waffle House, which I know sounds bizarre, but Waffle House is actually like a common thing that gets referenced all the time in disaster recovery. As like they have a corporate mission of like Waffle House is always open. But it turns out that almost everybody who runs a business, the world now expects you to be always open all the time, whether you're large or you're, a 10-person boutique. Like there's just no tolerance for that anymore. And so our role in this is really providing tools and solutions to sort of make that possible. And recently we've gotten more involved in sort of the acute response to specific disasters like hurricanes and things like that.
It's fascinating. We'll come back to that shortly. Emily, introduce yourself and what you do at UNICEF.
My name is Emily Guerin, and
I
work
closer there.
There we go. My name is Emily Guerin, and I work at UNICEF as a data and policy strategist, and have previously supported a lot of our work in humanitarian emergencies. And one of the things that we think about when we think about resilience, I would actually differ with your definition a little bit. It's not just the capacity to respond to a disaster, but it's the ability to anticipate and in many ways mitigate that disaster before it happens. That's what we believe true resilience is. And at UNICEF, we obviously start with the child at the center and then think about the concentric circles of support that that child needs to live a happy, healthy life. And when it comes to disasters, it's, you start in thinking about the digital resilience that is important between a child and their family. So that's the connectivity to know where your child is, be able to be in contact with them, understand their well-being, and get them to a place of safety. That then sort of radiates beyond that from the immediate family into the community and families further away, making sure you can access services, check in on family members that may be living in a different community, and then getting both outgoing understanding of the needs of those community as well as incoming access to services for them. And then the community itself relies ultimately on government services and making sure that those government services have that ring of connectivity that's essential to continue an uninterrupted delivery of services regardless of the conditions.
It's a fascinating role. I can't imagine your role as data strategist for UNICEF existed 15 years ago or even 10 years ago. What's the frontier of what you do for a living? How are you seeing it really change the game?
I mean, I'll take a very concrete example from an area I used to work in, which is, there's been a lot of movement in the humanitarian sector over the last 10 years, from moving from in-kind assistance like food and tents and all of those things to cash-based assistance, which is really fantastic. It empowers communities, it strengthens the local economy. And when I first started, we literally had sacks of cash in the communities that you would hand out. And you can imagine all of the challenges in handing out small stacks of cash to communities, especially those in crisis. And increasingly, that has moved into digital cash in currency, and in some agencies are even going into blockchain transfers right now. And that's obviously all brand new for us, and it's fantastic and exciting to be able to support communities much faster in a much more empowering way through digital transfer of cash. The challenge is that then makes us incredibly dependent on the connectivity of various systems, whereas if we were still going around with bags of cash, we could do that. And in the worst case scenarios, it may be essential to do that. But it's that shifting landscape where we've got more possibilities, we're improving our efficiency, but we become more and more reliant on making sure that that technology stays in place to allow us to deliver effectively for the families that need us most.
Mary, tell us what you do at the Weather Company.
I think I'm on the panel to represent a lot of the disasters.
You really are. I was going to call you the original gangster of disaster response, but I didn't think it was fair to you.
So if we look at disasters, it's really by far the most of those are weather and climate related. And so I'm with the Weather Company, Weather Channel, which we're now an IBM business. And I'm in charge of business solutions, but also have a key role in partnerships. The recognition that we really have to work as a global society for, I think, some of the reasons Mark outlined in terms of what we're seeing with climate change. We're seeing more severe storms and things like that. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals recognize that the private sector has to be involved in these. So we, I think because we come from the weather business and we focus a lot on forecasting, I think that resilience starts with preparedness, and preparedness starts with knowing what to expect and what the possible impacts of that are. So that's what we encourage both on our consumer outreach via app and all, and about preparedness as we run up to disasters. We have partnerships with the American Red Cross, for example. And what we do when working with business customers as well in helping them think through ahead of time what kind of actions that they need to take under various scenarios for that. So I think, I would also kind of underscore this point about the science and technology is enabling more and more, but at the same time it's challenging us to how we adapt, because what was, I think it was said this morning, I love the way it said, was a local insult that happens suddenly has regional, if not global, consequences to it. And I think that's germane to this topic.
Can you give one example that comes to mind?
Well, a personal one, I was saying to some other people, friends this morning, a friend who has a mother that's dealing with a really a pretty challenging cancer diagnosis. And it turns out, I certainly didn't know this, how many drugs are produced in Puerto Rico. And to this day, we're still not getting, the full supply back up and going. So you can be in McLean, Virginia, with a first-class healthcare provider, and you may be using choice number 2 as opposed to choice number 1, and we're 9 months out from that disaster.
Earlier in your career, you were at NOAA, and you've really been tracking this space for such a long time. I'm just wondering where you've seen us go, and where you see us going next.
So I think, one of the things I think a lot about is this intersection between science and technology and actually what happens on the ground. And I've watched in the weather community for a very long time how we were so good at donating equipment that no longer worked after we donated the equipment. And we're trying to, in discussions with the World Meteorological Organization, NOAA, the World Bank, UN Foundation, how we can start to change those models, to do that and leverage technology, because you actually don't need to put so much equipment on the ground, and people that are on the ground that would be responsible for forecasting typhoons and all could really focus very much on community outreach, because a lot of this, in terms of really encouraging people to take action, you have to have trust. There has to be a trust built up there, and that's a key part. So I think how we have science and technology, it gives us a lot of opportunities, but until we solve the kind of the on the ground, making it work there. So I'm really hopeful in that regard. I think the dialogues are kind of going in the right place.
It's a great segue to Matt from Cisco TAC Ops. How do you do what you do? And it really builds on that.
That's a good question, Lara. So, our team's been around for quite a while, started kind of informally after 9/11, formally in 2003, and got into the disaster response business in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. And like everybody else, we learned a lot of lessons the hard way. We sent millions of dollars of equipment, tons and tons of untrained engineers and RVs and everything. And they actually did a really great job, but we realized we need to be better prepared. So we need to train our people, we need to prepare our equipment, we need to have processes in place to deal with all that. And so since that time, we've really matured in that space, and we're able to do a lot of things simultaneously when it comes to disaster response, planned events, things like that. What we're looking at now, because we're seeing everybody is so reliant on technology in their personal lives as well as their professional lives, from small to medium businesses, enterprise, first responders, government. You can't deal with an emergency without technology hardly anymore. So what we're trying to do now is expand our reach by training other groups. So we're training our own employees, we are training volunteers from other NGOs in how to do what we do, work with DHS on developing some classes and how to do IT in disasters and how to be more resilient in your infrastructure ahead of time so you don't have this problem.
Sounds like taking a CPR course.
It kind of is.
So even before that next chapter you're talking about, training people on the ground, the stuff you do now is pretty interesting. You're going in with the firefighters in a wildfire situation, or, I mean, you've done it now many times. Give us some of the color from the ground.
Sure. So, it's pretty much the same process, whether it's in the United States or somewhere else.
Where are some of the places?
So the big one where we learned a lot of lessons the hard way, again, was in Haiti for international responses, and how do we, logistics of getting things in there. Some folks talked about, in-kind donations coming in. And, we had to sort our Cisco IP phones out from bottles of baby formula and diapers and stuff like that people didn't even ask for. So sorting all that out, figuring out, okay, what do people need? Where do they need it? How do I get it to them quickly? And then how do I think about transition? How do I think about, I'm going to bring this technology in and I can help, but what's going to happen on day 2? What's going to happen on day 30? What's going to happen on day 300? How do we get, a solution in place that's going to be sustainable for the long term? And you mentioned the CPR course thing. There's a saying in the fire service, because I'm also a firefighter in EMT, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to the level of your training. And that absolutely is true. The first time I had to do CPR, it was I just went back to my training and did this. And that's kind of why we're doing the training with these other groups, to basically have people be able to be resilient at a local level. If they already know, okay, when the infrastructure's down, here's what I need to do, here's what I need to go check. Most of the times it's what we call layer 1 problems. It's cabling and power. It's not some super technical issue that they have to go solve.
Emily, you work to protect and take care of the most vulnerable people in a community, the kids. Sometimes in the most vulnerable communities, the ones that didn't even have internet or good internet quality to begin with. What does it mean for these communities when the disruption hits? Either the developed or what are you seeing happen on the ground when the connectivity goes out?
Well, in some communities, as you've noted, the connectivity is not there. And that is part of the responsibility of UN agencies, of government agencies, et cetera, to make sure that those communities are connected ahead of time, not just for the day-to-day needs that they have in terms of education and healthcare and all of those pieces, but also specifically in cases like this. Even if you can have a community that is dealing with a systemic inequity that makes them not have connectivity day to day, and they can get through that when a crisis hits, or a health crisis like Ebola, to not have connectivity and not know what the appropriate health management techniques are and sanitation approaches and everything else makes our response significantly more difficult, and ultimately puts the lives of those children in communities at greater risk. So it becomes a more acute crisis, but it is part of the long-term inequities that UNICEF and other UN agencies are working very hard to address. And it continues to affect, we talk about the acute piece of the emergency here, but it's important to remember, as in Puerto Rico, that this is not a 1 or 2 week event. In many of these places, it's months, if not years, of recovery. And that recovery and rebuilding can perpetuate those inequities if we're not rebuilding in a more sustainable way, in a way that keeps communities connected and gives them access to a lot of other tools and technologies.
We heard earlier today about Google Project Loon, a lot of mesh networks, frontier efforts to connect communities. We also heard about what disruptions mean for public health, obviously for food systems and access, and we're seeing that across the country. Matt, you talked earlier today about how sometimes you go into a community and you end up providing something better than they had to begin with. You have to worry then about taking it away. Anything you can share from those stories about how you're trying to smooth that over? And
yeah, so when we go in, we always try to have a transition plan identified, even if it's, you know, figuring out, okay, is this equipment that maybe we can donate to a local charity, things like that. We've done it here in the U.S. working with, you know, trying to find cloud-based solutions, say for telephony, things like that. That's where some of the folks in the room today have got a lot of solutions there. So every mission is different, and we have to kind of take into account what are the needs of the customer, what's the local kind of political situation, local businesses, what's available. Because a lot of times there's somebody local that once they get back on their feet, they can solve the problem. So that's where we try to help connect the dots.
Austin, Datto had some really interesting experiences around Hurricane Sandy and again around Hurricane Harvey. Can you tell us about how that worked and anything you noticed across those two case studies?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that as Datto has grown, the landscape has definitely changed. And for us, originally Hurricane Sandy was very much, you know, a heavily localized event. We're based out of Connecticut, so we felt it even in our own office. And with that, we realized that we could get lots of people up and running, and also sort of realized, one, how quickly small business wants to get back up and running, that they don't have that tolerance for downtime, and then you know, just sort of how affected they were by all this stuff, and that they hadn't done the planning that you would normally expect sort of a business to do. Then when you look towards like Hurricane Harvey, that was a case where we saw this coming and said, we want to jump in and get involved. And so we did, and again, you know, it's a case of like good intention and lots of lessons learned there. And so we really learned a lot in that process, and we're actually able to apply some of that learning in Hurricane Irma, where we got involved again. But I think that, you know, events like this and getting different people to come together and to talk and to share expertise here is really how these things continue to improve. And it's amazing how little dialogue actually occurs between these different disparate groups, and whether they're NGOs or corporate sponsors, et cetera. All of a sudden, you know, everybody wants to be involved in a disaster, but when there's nothing going on, it's everyone's 53rd priority to sort it out, and figuring out how to find that balance so that everybody is prepared and it can actually work well is really important. And at least in our case, what we really look to is how do we work with the local communities that we're involved in, and in Datto's case, we have contacts on the ground, you know, just spread out all over the place, and so it's making sure that we work hand in hand with those local resources so they know that we're there if they need something, whether that's technical expertise, whether that is physical equipment, et cetera, and that we really want to serve and try to unite them so that they're going to better be able to help their constituent small businesses get back up and running as quickly as possible.
That whole thing about an ounce of prevention.
Yeah.
We heard earlier today also from Geeks Without Frontiers and other networks that are being built who want to be help and want to help and are ready to help. You talked about the network of your partners on the ground.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about those partners and what they're ready to
So absolutely. So a little bit about our business that's unique is that we don't sell to small businesses. We sell through small businesses to small businesses. And the average small business out there really can't manage or run their IT themselves. The idea that you're going to have your uncle's smart kid come set up your stuff, that just doesn't work anymore. And so instead they're turning to this group of businesses called managed service providers that basically serve as the virtual CIO for a community. And they'll do, you know, anywhere from 50 to several hundred small businesses they're providing that IT service and support. And so that's where we sell all of our traditional products, and they really represent us kind of on the ground. And so those are the people that we look at, you know, in a disaster response scenario. How do we support them? One, to get them back up and running as quickly as possible so then they can go support their constituent small businesses that they work with.
in some cases driving a truck down to.
Yeah, no,
where they are.
absolutely. So it's definitely, you know, starting to get more involved in that as far as, you know, early on we just rented some cars, and then you realize, how inexpensive some things are when you think about sort of other things that you spend at the company. And I remember this conversation about like where were we going to, we saw this other hurricane and our thought was, well, we should send a vehicle. When it's like, well, we should go buy a vehicle. And then it was, well, where am I going to get the money? And it's like, well, we can just not do some marketing event. And it turns out you can buy an entire car, you know, versus not doing some small thing that sits on your calendar. So it's like, it's impressive that if you want to, you can go find those things. And for us, you know, it was interesting because it was very important to us that we go do this, but then not make it a marketing story, not talk about it until long after it had occurred. And I think that's really paid back in spades for us because it is about the impact that we can have and not about, hey, look, we did a good thing, because that just gets in the way of doing good things.
Look, we heard a lot today about what we on my team usually call the karmic upside. You kind of do it, and then you learn so much from it that you've got something to share. And we heard it from Cisco TAC Ops, we heard it from Needs List, we heard it from a lot of organizations that just created solutions and then found themselves basically by creating that plug-in. What was that word? The patch. The patch solution. Found themselves able to move that into really interesting spaces, transportation, housing, etc. For those watching the live stream, if you'd like to ask a question, we've got some interesting ones coming in here. Just tweet us at NewsDeeply, at NEWSDEEPLY, hashtag digital resilience. We're going to get to one of those questions in a second, but first I'd love to hear Mark's thoughts on what prevention looks like when you're talking about digital resilience. In particular, how do we make our very, very important digital infrastructure more hardened to all this?
Okay, I can address that in the context of a funny story. So 3 years ago, we had Snowmageddon in Boston, where we had back-to-back snowstorms that were rendering the commuter rail inoperable and stranding people in the city. And I had a bright student in my lab, Ethan Edson, who's now my tech, working on a microplastic sampler funded by Google. But I was calling up Ethan on the phone saying, hey, buddy, I don't think you're going to be able to get in to work with me tomorrow. And he goes, oh, the university's closing in 2.5 hours. And I said, excuse me? There's nothing in the Northeastern website about this. And he said, oh, I already found about it through social media. I said, you did? And I said, well, how did you find this out? You know, I'm on the faculty. They're supposed to tell me first. And he was using a hyperlocal app that doesn't even exist anymore. I think it was called Yik Yak, that showed you like the 1,000 people anonymously closest to you. And somebody in the president's office had yik-yacked out that the president had already decided to close the university, and he found out, you know, almost instantaneously. The point of this is that there are many, many different channels that are changing all the time on how we stay connected. On the business side, things change more slowly, but certainly on the social, self-rescue, civil society side, things are changing fast. One of the things I learned doing disaster response as an amateur radio operator on numerous natural disasters is the value of training that Matt brought up. I don't know if you're aware, but the biggest civil defense, communications, resilience, practice exercise ever takes place every year, the last week of June, when more than 40,000 volunteer radio operators go off the grid, give up a weekend. When I say go off the grid, they have to operate the radios not on the electrical mains, but on solar or wind or hydropower. And they have a contest in the US and Canada. They try and pass as much message traffic as possible in 24 hours.
Without any
This is just for fun, without a break. This is just for fun, but it's the largest communications resilience exercise in the world, and it's been going on for 80 years. That's why amateur radio services licensed by the FCC really are the first responders, usually the first boots on the ground at reestablishing communications in a disaster areas because of that repetitive training. It's the CPR of getting communications up and running.
Do you think then we need digital communication fire drills for more systems to practice like that?
So this is actually of interest to the amateur radio community. Being an amateur radio operator gives you incredible privileges. For example, we're all sitting here talking on wireless microphones. We've got cell phones in our pocket. There's a wireless router over there, but they're all emitting small amounts of power. You get a ham license, you can use those exact same frequencies and do 1,500 watts if you were so inclined. Now that's a lot of power at microwaves. I wouldn't probably do that because if a pigeon flew in front of your antenna, it would probably fall out of the sky. The point is that digital multimedia, rapid setting up to recover the functionality to keep people connected is now a thing because of the off-the-shelf technology and the new software development kits. So it is going to be possible in future disasters not just to have the bursty sort of communications we heard about from some of the companies that were here earlier that get text and welfare messages through, but you will be able, or you should be able in the future, if we truly have a resilient system, I hate to say it, to watch the cat videos to help you de-stress during the emergency. That's actually something we've been studying when we've been trying to figure out our resilient solution at the Global Resilience Institute is people do want to do things during an emergency to de-stress. They want to listen to music. They might want to watch a cat video. We still want to get the calls into 911. We still want to keep the small businesses going because they don't have a lot of time before they go out of business. But we also have to recognize that we are social beings and that we're using this technology in new ways to stay connected. And some of that may, you might say, well, we can't do that, but in the future we will.
Thank you, Mark. I don't think we had an appreciation for amateur radio before that we have now after listening to you. Really fascinating. Mary, do you think we're getting smarter about response and resilience? I mean, and what do some of these devices translate into in the modern era?
So I do think we're getting smarter, but at the same time, I think it's, again, as new science and technology comes in, this idea of interconnectedness and the interdependency, really, I think we have complications that we don't always recognize, and it takes a disaster to expose some of those. So I do think that that's at play. I want to underscore a little bit. One of the things that we talked about earlier in the day, some of the speakers raised, was every citizen, every person can be part of kind of first response. How do we really get individuals more prepared to help? Because even large organizations, it takes a long time to get down to that level. And the other part of it, I think, is the creativity part. We're constantly seeing new innovative things. And again, I think you said this earlier, some of what we heard about today came out of disasters. People were trying to help and they learned something, and now they have actually developed, a mission around that. So I think we'll see more of those as well. We're really good as a species at adapting.
I like to think. I hope so. We do refer to these resilience issues as species-level issues on our team, so it's good to share lessons and ideas. And a question came in on, is anyone providing digital resilience technology and tools for executives to use at home? Anybody have a thought on that?
I mean, I think it just depends on how much money you want to spend. Like the difference between being an executive and a business is just dollars. So anything you get for a business, you could put in your house. It might suck, but you could do it.
Like?
Well, but you could buy the professional version of, for example, GoTenna was talking. You could buy, you could have high-end Cisco IP gear. You could have a satellite transceiver at your house if that was what you were so inclined to do. The barrier is really just there's a cost gradient as you move up along that process, and so you have to decide, how much resilience is important to you, and then make those choices.
Matt, any thoughts?
I was just going to say, in terms of executives, I've actually done some consulting for resilience, for communications for our own executives, and some of the issues are not technological. some of them get it, like at one point I was suggesting, hey, let's put a satellite dish at this person's house, and the answer was, yeah, the HOA won't allow that. So
HOA?
the homeowners association, yeah. So there's different ways to approach it. I think just starting with the basics, having multiple phone carriers, satellite phones, things like that. That's where I would start, and then, like Austin said, as much money as you want to spend, do it.
Go ahead, Emily.
But I think some of these examples are getting at a couple of much bigger, deeper issues. And while it seems relatively funny to think about the HOA piece, what this lends itself to is, A, we need to be considering what those needs are and anticipating them, whether it's at an executive's home or whether it's for a national disaster response agency, anticipating those ahead of time. B, financing those pieces and recognizing that financing is not the only challenge, and that it is often the political will and the politics surrounding it that keep the financing from becoming available or keep the financing from reaching the communities that need it most. And C, we then have to match that potential technology directly with the needs that we have identified. One of the main challenges that we have now is, in some ways, the wonderful bounty of generosity that comes from corporations and individuals now recognizing corporate social responsibility and wanting to share their assets with us, but they want to share those assets at the outset of an emergency. And really what needs to happen is in those places where we know a natural disaster is very likely to happen, we need to anticipate what those needs are, set up those partnerships ahead of time, and have them ready to deploy ahead of when the disaster hits, because it's wonderful to get that offer of partnership, but that's not the time to do it. So you can take whichever example from the smallest to the largest, but it's those same principles that apply underneath all of them every time.
Like they say, a catastrophe is no time to exchange business cards.
Exactly.
You've seen a lot of these partnerships work. Can you give us some examples and some lessons learned on you and Mary? You've all worked on partnerships in different ways. What's helping them along, and what are you learning from doing them?
Well, I think part of it is a lot of education about each other in terms of you really have to understand what's happening kind of on the ground and what the constraints are there that often you can't see unless you're there to do that. So I think that those are some of the key things that are there. I think the other thing is, and we heard this earlier, I forget who made the comment, you get to a disaster and then, there's so many satellite dishes you can hardly move in Haiti because everybody brought their own satellite dish. And it's about harmonization. How could we do a better job because we know that disaster is coming again, and, to pick out a role that companies can play, and that's going to be their niche kind of thing, so that it's a little more harmonized. And I don't, that's kind of what I'm trying to do and trying to herd conversations around a number of organizations that are aid organizations, because I think the private sector is in a best role to complement, not to lead the charge there, if there were a common vision on that.
Emily, then Mark.
Yeah, I would say one of the big lessons that we've learned is just how difficult it is to articulate our needs. I've worked in the data space for the last couple of years. We have a lot of the biggest name corporations coming to us, wanting to share some of their data with us to help us in disaster response specifically. But we need to move from being reactive to that offer of assistance to being proactive in identifying what our needs are in anticipation of an earthquake in a vulnerable community. What is it that we're going to need, and who's best positioned to give us that data or share that data with us, and who should we be reaching out to in advance? And that has been a much harder enterprise-wide experience than we expected it to be. And I think it's very important to undertake that. But what comes along with that is a necessary restraint. It's really tempting to go and form those partnerships immediately with the big name corporations because it's great for them, it looks great for us, but that may not be the most strategic use of our time or the best use of their technology or data. And so having that both ability to articulate needs and the restraint that's necessary to not jump at what looks like a great opportunity but may not be the most strategic use of limited resources has been difficult, but I think it's an important ongoing project for all agencies and administrations that hope to deliver services.
Do you feel that the practice of public-private partnership is maturing? Are we getting smarter about all these? Anybody want to take that?
I can jump in on that too. Go ahead.
So the federal government has tried to cheerlead in this area. It actually came out of 9/11. The Citizen Corps was created, and these community emergency response teams were formalized. A CERT, as it's called, is a group of volunteers in a community. Everybody knows everybody, and again, training is part of the equation and best practices so that you, in your hometown or even your neighborhood, have somebody that's expert at first aid, somebody that's expert in communications resilience, somebody that's expert in health issues or taking care of seniors. And this CERT effort was a noble effort. That said, fast forward to Hurricane Sandy that Datto helped on and others. Sandy was a very interesting event because remember Occupy Wall Street, that social movement that was in Lower Manhattan, you know, trying to shame the high net worth hedge fund managers, et cetera. When Sandy hit, they became Occupy Sandy, and 60,000 volunteers showed up in the disaster zone that had just been, which was part of Lower Manhattan actually, and they used their digital savvy and their training in social media and setting up networks, et cetera, and went into the communities. And usually in every little area, there's somebody who's like the local mayor. You know, everybody knows who's the mayor, air quotes, in their block. And they would find these people and engage with them. And DHS did a really interesting study that showed in an after-action report that Occupy Sandy had 4 times as many people on the ground as FEMA and the American Red Cross. And they were far more effective at establishing communications at the neighborhood level and getting information out and providing the resilience that we're talking about here. So I think there's more opportunities to cheerlead this. And on the United Nations side, there's probably lots we can learn interculturally from how approaches are done in other cultures that perhaps could come to the States and inform some of these civil society responses.
As we picked out earlier, it's been fascinating to hear these case studies from the US when within the UN and the global humanitarian response system, the imperative for localization, more emphasis, more solutions, and more investment at the local level has been really, in theory, at the fore since the World Humanitarian Summit a couple years ago, but still learning, still figuring out what does it mean for these solutions that get figured out on the ground, and how do you empower those local communities? Emily, does anything spark for you around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is obviously a lot easier to talk about localization of solutions than it is to implement them. And I think that we have this tug of war, in part, between the desire and the need for scalability and taking things to a large scale very quickly, very efficiently, and making solutions that are appropriate and tailored to the communities in which we are working. And we are working to make sure that both of those things can happen in tandem, but there is definitely a tension between them. And so part of the value of agencies and entities that are on the ground both before, during, and after a crisis is knowing that local contextualization. Things like, you should not be using blue shelter tents here because there is a communal prohibition against, or there's a superstition against the use of the color blue. That is not a thing that an organization parachuting in is going to know or understand. And that's a relatively simple solution. We have white tents and we have blue tents, and we can just ship the white tents if we need to ship them. But it's that ability to scale at a large organization, but also making sure we maintain the local context that is really, really important. And we can't lose sight of either of those, but it creates a greater challenge for us as we move forward.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Matt, did you want to pipe in on partnerships or anything you
learned? Oh, and the public-private partnership, yeah, we're seeing a lot of engagement at this at the federal and the state level. So there's a group that FEMA and DHS sponsors called the NBEOC, National Business Emergency Operations Center, and it's got everybody from communications side to, you know, the Walmarts and Lowe's and Home Depot and those sorts of folks that can get resources where they need to go in an emergency. And that's actually getting started down at the state level in a lot of areas too. We're pretty pretty big in that in North Carolina, Virginia, and California right now. So there's a lot of outreach, and they're realizing, hey, the government doesn't always have to be the one to solve the problem.
We've had a question come in really continuing to drill down on these issues of prevention. And what does it take to really de-risk modern life? Modern life is set up in ways that really rely on not just the built environment that can be vulnerable, but also the digital infrastructure. So a couple of things I'd like to touch on within that. One, you know, Austin and Matt, are you seeing from the small business or the business community, is it hard to get people to invest in that prevention up front? And what are some of the convincing arguments you can make when it is tough?
I mean, I think the story here is it's pretty complex as far as actually getting people to put money in up front, because it's insurance and they're unsure if they're ever going to need it. And then they feel like, especially on the technology side, like anything they do now, 5 years from now, it's going to be out of date. And it's kind of like if you told people to prepare from an IT perspective for the big one in California, and somebody went and spent a whole bunch of money in 1995 to do that, all of that money is worth nothing at this stage. And so it's very difficult to sort of get them to do things. And in our case, what we see is that can we deploy stuff that provides some benefit now that's not just, hey, this is the thing in an emergency. It also does other stuff that you use and you like. And you know, this was even a topic of conversation that we had earlier about someone who's working on building houses and was like, oh, look, we can get a lot of people to build a more resilient house if we offer them to move into a bigger house. And so it's the same sort of thing applies on the technology side of like, if it's a net improvement on the technology and it just so happens to include resilience, that's great, but just resilience in its own right, it's few and far between are really willing to make the appropriate investment there.
Any arguments that either of you found effective in trying to get people to move on that premise?
I think Austin hit, there's kind of the carrot and the stick. Austin's talking about the carrot with the bigger house. A good example on the security side is the stick, right? So think about all the data breaches that you hear about, and there is a true financial cost to these things. So the question, because we're actually a part of Cisco's Security and Trust organization, so the question that we ask our customers, you know, when they say, hey, these security solutions are expensive, we say, hey, let's look at what is the cost of not doing this? What's the cost of not patching your systems, not monitoring your networks? And a lot of cases, it's way less than it is to respond to a data breach. So those kind of things. And he stole my example about the bigger houses, too. So.
Well, one of your colleagues, Doug, who's here from an MSP here in the DC area, is that right, was really talking about helping people really see that calculation. Like, it really comes down to safety. Safety would cost you this much, yeah, X, but actually it doesn't cost you as much. It costs you much less than that. Is that enough of an argument? You know, can you make that rational?
I mean, I think there's a TCO story, obviously, about it. There's the idea that, you know, your risk factor, you know, you talk about it as a big business level of how painful a breach is, and at a small business level, it's like, well, your business is over. And if you're not able to get up and running in like 30 days or so, most small businesses can't survive that level of disruption. And the challenge that we saw is that for traditional landline ISP, like a 30-day recovery time window is good as far as they're concerned. And so if you're cloud dependent, which most small businesses are, that's a huge problem. Yeah, I think that more and more of them are seeing it. And you can sort of talk about it around sort of that outage component that, you know, it makes the evening news that you can't get to Amazon.com for the first 30 minutes of Prime Day, and like people are mad and upset. And so it's that same sort of belief that these services should be available all the time passes down to even the smallest of small businesses. And so people can rationalize around that and see it as a sensible investment in that light.
Expectations.
I was going to say, there's examples of it that kind of approach working outside of technology. So in the fire service, we have something called a fire and life safety educator, and that's the guy that's, you know, teaching kids how to stop, drop, and roll, how to check your fire alarms and things like that. And through programs like that, we've actually decreased the number of house fires and decreased the number of deaths and injuries due to fires and injuries and things like that. So it's basically, you know, that's proof right there that it's going to work.
You guys are like the most interesting panelists I've been around for a while. You're a firefighter. Mark lived underwater for 3 months as a marine biologist. I'm waiting to hear what I'm going to find out the rest of you guys. Emily, you wanted to jump in on the prevention front?
I was going to say, I think there are definitely more political solutions that we can come up with at that macro level in terms of doing the economic analysis on the return on investment, doing political organizing around getting budgetary investments, et cetera. But it's also important to remember that a lot of resilience happens at the individual, at the family level. And there is a lot of unexplored territory, I think, in looking at behavioral economics and some of those nudges that we can get families to do. There's been a lot of research that's gone into how do we get families to increase savings, how do we get them to change the way that they're spending the finances in their house, and that's been largely as a poverty reduction effort. But I think focusing that same type of research and analysis on how we can do very small, subtle behavioral changes at a local, individual level can have that more systemic impact, especially in places where the government has lower capacity to deliver. You can get communities to start making some of those changes if we really focus some more resources on what the behavioral change elements are that we want to see at a local level.
You're talking from a very interesting vantage point. Of course, we've covered UNICEF in refugee contexts, in conflict contexts, in Syria and Venezuela, where we work. And you know as well as I do this trope now that when refugees are crossing borders, the first thing they ask for is internet access and connectivity. And that one disruption is the difference between not having food on the table, or your kid not going to school, or your kid being forced to work instead of going to school. And so when you're talking about that vulnerability, my mind immediately jumps to those contexts that I know you're working in and know really very well. I'd love to hear, well, first, a little call out to that, to Build Change, the organization that brought in the housing example, and that happens to be sitting here in the room with us as well. And then another really interesting example, listen just in the past 5 minutes how things that were learned in one sector had so much to give us in other sectors when it came to planning, preparation. Another thing that came up this morning is having the pieces in place. You guys are talking about it from a regulatory perspective. When you figure out what works, you talked about funding flows, special funds, making sure the funding is there before and not just after the disaster. So a lot of things that we're learning nationally and internationally about how we manage these situations. Mary, I can't stop really finding it cool. I can't stop finding it cool. The way, the Weather Channel, all of us turn to you guys, not just for storm chasers, but for vital information. You're now part of the big data revolution. You're part of IBM. You can see more of these storms coming more often with more lead time. What's the future of what we can see and how we plan for it?
So I think there's a lot we're on the cusp of. In fact, we're just about to roll out a new app next month in terms of really providing information in a way that makes it easier for people to make decisions. We've come a long way in the science if I just look at hurricane track kind of thing, but getting people to actually understand what that means to them, what their level of risk is locally, I think still remains a challenge in some of these things. So I think we'll see more things, in our world, we're focused on things like this. How do we take, how do we make that a great experience for our consumer? And then on the business side, it's a lot about tailoring to that particular business, and this is where the data science really comes in because they have all their business data, and we can do a lot of correlations and derive a lot of insights and give predictions, not just of the weather, but of the impact. And I'm flying later today. I suspect other people in this room are flying later today. But how proactively decisions are made in aviation on, what the forecast is.
Transportation across the board.
Yeah, just all across. And that's just one example of that. I do want to, while I have the mic, I just want to come back a little bit to the individual kind of thing, because I do think it's people that make a difference in the end, and we have very short memories. The disaster is gone, Sandy is gone, it's 5 years later, and it's really easy to forget. In this town of Washington, D.C., after 9/11, it was, people were prepared, they had their water, they had their food. We're now into hurricane season. I wonder how many people are really prepared to be able to be on their own for 3 days and not dependent on someone outside. So I think finding, we do need to find ways through social media and other things and networks and organizations about how to motivate on the ground communities, because I think that's where so much of the resilience comes from. It's not going to parachute in. That's a longer term more complicated things. So you need to look at the weeks, really, following a disaster being locally.
And it's not just our imaginations. There are more frequent and more intense storms than ever. The Economist had a statistic of the number of disasters worldwide quadrupled since 1970. I don't know if that's the specific one.
Certainly, I think that that's as measured by the economic impact. Billion-dollar disasters have been going up. That curve is really pretty steep. You know, I think Mark alluded to earlier, we're clearly seeing really extremes in precipitation, whether it's droughts in your area. But I think the thing that's really hurting a lot of people are the flash flood, the flooding situation overall. And we have population growth globally. And that population often chooses to live, I think about wildfires and on the coast, in areas that they're vulnerable to these type of things.
We were at an event last week at the UN, the Disaster Risk Reduction Agency that the UN operates, really underscoring for everyone, we're not just imagining things. Asia is the #1 continent for these disasters, and the Americas are the #2 zone for these. So it really is a hyper-local issue and a global issue.
And people don't generally know it, but in this country, we have more variety of weather disasters. Only China rivals us. So if you're looking for, you know, we got it all.
Something else we have in common.
Great. So we got disasters.
Great. Well, in the very few minutes we've got left, I'd love to hear from each of you one thing you wish someone would do, either the general public or, you know, one thing that you, if you could wave a magic wand, would change about one set of behaviors, Mark and all the way down here.
Well, if it's one thing I've learned is that human behavior has been a constant. I'm an evolutionary biologist, so, you know, our behaviors have been selected for by living in an ice age. That said, I think the thing that I would like to see going forward to increase our resilience in this age of digital connectivity is just to leverage the altruistic traits that all societies have in more powerful ways because of the technology.
Amazing.
And that's going to take many different interesting forms. Some of it's going to be at the individual neighborhood level, and some of it will be at the entire, you know, national, nation-state level.
I think for me it's really planning and planning at the local and hyper-local sort of micro level. And that it's tough that when these disasters and things happen, it's just everybody wants to do everything all at once. And it's one of those things where, like, if you had written down, all right, here's the 7 things that we're going to do. These are the things that are important. Like, to be able to refer back to that and follow the list is so helpful, and trying to generate that list at the moment of disaster is the worst time to do so.
I'm going to give you a super nerdy answer. I want countercyclical financing. So in a good unemployment insurance system, employers pay in when times are good and employment is high, and when the economy tanks and lots of people need to claim unemployment insurance, the rates go down and people can claim it and employers are not paying a higher tax. It's exactly the same thing that we need when it comes to finance for disasters. And it works, we know it works, and it takes a lot of political will to get there, and that's what I would wave my magic wand and get.
Emily, these are all nerdy answers, so you're not alone on this.
But I just got smarter listening to that answer. I didn't know that.
That's what we like to hear.
So I think I'm going to come back to my theme about technology and then people and culture and social networks. And I think we need to see more creativity in that. And I'll put a little shout out. IBM is working with the David Clark cause and the UN human rights thing and the American Red Cross, and we have a competition, a contest going on there that actually has money at the other end of it, prize money. It's called Call for Code. I'd love to see a lot of engagement in that, because I think there's some cool things that could be done in garages and basements.
I'll keep mine real quick. One word: practice. The folks that we see that are the most successful in emergencies are not the people with the coolest toys. They're the ones that know how to use the ones they've got.
We had one comment come in. We don't have time to get to the question, but it was, forget Amazon Prime Day access. We lost 911 for 2 counties for several days after losing a microwave tower. So looking at single points of failure, next time we have an hour together. Thank you guys so much for being part of this. Thank you for everyone who's here and those who are watching on the live stream. Thank you.